All right, Tom, take it away.
Well, good morning. Welcome to Tom Talks. This Tom Talk today really goes back for me to 1985. That was, I think I had mentioned to my mother, I was at school at Auburn University in Alabama. My mother was a librarian, and I mentioned that I wanted to read The Origin of Species, having never read it and heard about it. And I was a young, well, at least I thought I was young. I was in my 30s at that time. Student in ecology, and it just seemed like something I should read. And so I got a copy and I read it. And I've since read it. I have no idea how many times. The book changes over time. I can remember what I thought when I first read it as a sort of factual account of someone thinking about evolution and natural selection, and how it changed over time as I began to understand Darwin better, understand the sort of scientific background of the 19th century better, and began to really think of myself as a conservationist, and then look back at The Origin of Species and start to think of it in that context. So all those things are going to come up today as we go through the book. One of the most important books in the history of Western science, without any question. As I go through it, there'll be a lot of quotes of Darwin, and all the quotes will come from the first edition of The Origin of Species, unless it's noted otherwise. A couple of quotes will come from the earlier book, The Voyage of the Beagle. And then I think there's one or two quotes on the descent of man and selection related to sex that came out a couple of decades, or not, but a little over a decade after The Origin of Species. This is me and Charles at Christ College, Cambridge, a few years back. That's where Darwin went to college. Immediately when he graduated from here, he was going on the Voyage of the Beagle. And at this point, he's about 23 years old. And I'm comforted again because he's kind of anxious about, well, going on a 3-year voyage around the world. You know, he's really lived a pretty sheltered existence. He went to the University of Edinburgh for a while, studying to be a doctor, or his father told him he was going to be a doctor. But Charles didn't like the idea too much. He was sort of grossed out by human cadavers, and he preferred collecting beetles. He was also a great sportsman. He loved horseback riding and shooting, or what we would call hunting in this country. So he's very much an outdoorsman, a sort of budding naturalist, didn't really want to be a doctor. So his father sends him to Cambridge to really to be a country parson, to join the Church of England, not so demanding academically as being a doctor. And his father thought that might be better for young Charles. So I'm just giving Charles a pat on the back here and sending him off on the voyage. I want you to think for a while, what do you think? Why don't you put it in the chat? What do you think of when you hear the name Charles Darwin? So just put it in the chat, and Jackie can read them off.
We're starting to get some answers in. So Galapagos, intelligence, misunderstood, change, evolution. Forward thinker. Evolution of life.
What?
Another evolution.
Yeah, turns out all of you are correct. I mean, he was all those things. I think what you'll find today, as I emphasize, is maybe a slightly different aspect of Darwin than you first think. Any more, Jackie?
An important naturalist and great observer working with inadequate information.
Very much the case. Let's well, first of all, I want to tell you what I'm not going to talk about today, because I think Darwin has become a sort of parody sometimes in popular culture. I'm not going to talk much about the sort of the diagram on the left side is one you've probably seen, at least depending on if you're in the life sciences like I am, you've probably seen dozens of diagrams like this, the monkey to man, linear evolution going from simple to complex, from dumb to brainy, that sort of idea of evolution, very controversial at the time, still is, or the numerous cartoons of Darwin on the right, because of that immediate going from an idea, really an idea of so much larger than any talk about human evolution, really about the origin of species on Earth, and yet about the only thing often people think about when they think about Darwin is that monkey to man diagram on the left. So we're not going to talk about that much of that today. Rather, we're going to talk about Darwin the naturalist and thinker. I figured that looks like he's around 50 years old, which is when he published The Origin of Species. He was a beetle collector from the time of being a young man, a person with an enormous gift for the minutiae of life. He studied barnacles for the longest time, wrote several treatises on barnacles, some obscure little creatures, the differences between species being minute. And so he had a fine idea for detail, and yet also had a brilliant mind for theory, which is very rare in the history of science, to get those two things together in the same person. So this is the Darwin we're going to talk about today, a person of letters. He wrote literally thousands of letters. Just looking at Joseph Hooker, who was a close friend and associate, I think they have 1,400 letters that just the two of them exchanged, not to mention all the other associates Darwin regularly communicated with. It was like email, email of its day, only this was paper mail and snail mail. These were letters that were traveling literally all over the world, conveying information back and forth between Darwin and other naturalists. Darwin was on the Beagle. The voyage of the Beagle lasted from 1831 to 1836. And so this is just after he comes back. He's reorganizing his notes on the voyage, and he starts notebooks on the transmutation of species. Had been greatly struck from about a month previous March on the character of South American fossils and species on Galapagos archipelago. These facts, origin especially latter, of all my views. And so you can see very soon after coming back, these ideas about what we now think of as evolution. He originally called it a transmutation of species. He later referred to it usually I'll come back to that later. I just zipped out of my mind. One thing I want to do now is a step back for just a moment. We're going to talk a lot about science and where science kind of fits into our understanding of ourselves. So I want to make my own point of view on this clear to start with. I can't after respect a whole wide diversity of accounts and what it means to be a human being and what our relationships are to each other, our communities, and to the non-human world around us. So without believing I can derive any of them from a purely rational account of the physical world. So science for me is important, but I don't confuse it with a lot of other things that I do and what I feel. My relationship to my daughters and my wife, my family, the community I go to, all those things are really outside of my life as a scientist. And I think, that's where I see science fitting into my world. It's possible to find science beautiful, inspiring, which I do. Kind of raising the hair on the back of my neck's inspiring, not infrequently, as well as useful, while at the same time rejecting it as a totalizing explanation of the human experience. Frequently, you'll find some pretty outsized interpretations of science and what science can do and how much we should listen to science. But I want to challenge some of that today and come back to this idea right at the end of the presentation when we start talking about Darwin and conservation. I think rather science is a distillation of our ability to observe and reason about the material world. And it's proven to be a very powerful tool in allowing us to understand and control nature And what I mean by nature here is really just in the sense of natural science. And because science is a human endeavor, it's flawed. I mean, some people will point to the flaws of science and try to discredit the enterprise, but it's simply a human endeavor, and so it's obviously flawed. It's not hard to see in retrospect how we can look back at science a few hundred years ago and see the cultural biases, but it's nearly impossible to recognize our own biases in the present. And I like to imagine that we all have a sort of cart we're pulling behind us in life. It's invisible, so we don't know it's there. It doesn't have any draw weight, so we can't tell that we've got that cart behind it. That cart is full of all the biases of our culture, and we're swimming in them. We're breathing them in and out every day, and we'll never recognize them in our life. Probably our grandchildren will recognize some of them if you live to be a very old person. Your grandchildren will listen to you and they'll think, oh my gosh, what is that old guy thinking about? But we'll be unable to see them in our own ideas in the present. And I think it's not really a criticism of Darwin, and I will criticize him today about some of the sort of the unvarnished ideas he pulls out of 19th century society and imposes on nature, because we all do that. And so in looking back at Darwin, our challenge is to see what it was original, incredibly original and interesting and useful he told us about the natural world, and at what times he seemed to be bringing in ideas from the culture around him that probably aren't very useful. And despite all of its human flaws, science shows a remarkable ability to self-correct over time, and for new science to shatter the mold of old science and to move toward a more consistent, useful account of how the material world operates. That's the inspiring and spine-tingling part of science for me. In the middle of the 19th century, Charles Darwin was a central figure in the violent rupture of an old science that had found a more or less peaceful accommodation with the social traditions and institutions of the time. That is the sense in which I call Darwin the man who broke nature. We'll come back to that again later in the presentation, but that's what I meant by it. He was a part. He didn't act alone. While he was a bit of a recluse in his maturity, seldom leaving Down House, where he lived with his family in the south side of London, he exchanged many thousands of letters with scientists and naturalists from around the world and borrowed much from the shifting, changing intellectual world of the 19th century. I mean, to understand 19th century science, such a fascinating period, because science was really, people were really beginning to think of themselves for the first time as scientists. Before that, they were naturalists and they were philosophers, but people were beginning to think of themselves as scientists. Science as science was beginning to sort of recognize itself and look at itself. The science of geology had revolutionized our understanding of time and change, and what later authors would call deep time, of time that goes back not hundreds or thousands of years, but millions, hundreds of millions of years, and we now understand is billions of years into the past. So that revolution was already going on as Darwin was growing up, but he really focused that and brought it out in a way that has really made him the sort of paragon of that period of scientific change. So how I want to organize this today is really to talk about who Darwin was. I've mentioned just a few things so far, but to try to give you a little understanding of Darwin, the human being, try to frame an historical context of that 19th century when Darwin was alive, and the ideas that were swirling around in society around him, to really look closely at Darwin's argument for evolution by natural selection. I mean, he calls the book The Origin of Species one long argument. And if you go through it, it's structured exactly that way. He's arguing all the way through, gathering evidence, arguing his point against traditional views, which at that time were divine creation. There were also views that came from previous evolutionists like Jean Lamarck of France, and he's arguing against those as he presents his model of how life has changed. And right at the end, I want to talk about what his relevance to conservation is, because it may not be obvious as I go through this why the McHenry County Conservation District, whom I work, what interest they have in Darwin, and what interest as a conservationist I have in Darwin. This is Charles Darwin as a young man. I think this is actually like 1836, right around the time he was thinking about marriage. I'd come back from the Beagle. Uh, Darwin Darwin was a when I was at the Morton Arboretum, I remember one person who asking, sort of just asking anyone in the room, what did Darwin do for a living? I mean, you're trying to think, what was his 9-to-5 job? How did he support himself to be able to spend all this time looking at beetles and writing and reading letters and performing experiments and writing books? What did he do? And the answer is, we Americans have a hard time understanding the British class system. Darwin was a privileged member of the British upper class, part of the landowning gentry. He married into money. His wife, Emma, who was his first cousin, his mother's brother's daughter. And she was of the Wedgwood family, of the pottery fame. So Darwin grew up in wealth. His father was wealthy. He did work as a doctor. And so Darwin really never had a 9-to-5 job. His father, in fact, while he was a bit disappointed in Charles for not wanting to be a doctor, his father thought a good way for him to experience the world was to support him in his voyage on the Beagle. You see, he had to buy his passage on the Beagle. It cost a lot of money to support someone for 3 to 5 years. His father bought his place on the Beagle and purchased all the scientific equipment he would need on the voyage. I mean, as we know now, it was money well spent, because that became literally the epicenter of all his thought about evolution and how he revolutionized our understanding of life. All of it at least began with that voyage on the Beagle. Interesting story about Darwin. As you read the book, if you do, I'm often struck by what a completely materialistic thinker he is. I don't mean materialistic in which sense in which that word is sometimes used today. I mean someone who liked fancy cars and houses and just spent money. No, materialist in the sense of philosophy, meaning that all of your thinking has to be done by observation of facts in the world and reasoning, very, very close reasoning according to those facts about trying to explain change in the world. He was a materialist philosopher. He kept notes, assiduous notes and notebooks on all of his work, which are a great gift to historians today. You can go back through the thousands and thousands of letters and all of his notebooks to try to reconstruct how his ideas came together. But he was such a rationalist that when he was about to get married to Emma, he was, maybe like many of us, kind of wondering about this institution of marriage and what it would mean. And so he had to write down lists of pros and cons about getting married. And on the pro side, in favor of marriage, he said having a companion in old age. And then the next line was better than a dog anyhow. And on the con side, in other words, disadvantages of marriage, he said, well, less money for books and terrible waste of time. I'd like to think that, I mean, you don't find much humor in Darwin. I'd like to think that there was at least a little bit of humor there. Sometimes as I read Darwin and the sort of cold-blooded reasoning he uses, I do wonder sometimes whether that was humorous or not. But in any event, the 19th century, when Darwin grew up, starting in 1809 and dying in 1882, was a period of tremendous social change. The Industrial Revolution, England goes from agrarian society to a world industrial power. With that growth of industry comes a huge expansion of wealth and a huge expansion of abject poverty in the cities. All of this is a social background for Darwin. It's a period of the tremendous expansion of the British Empire, in which it truly becomes the world power. 1815, I think, is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. They become the world power, control of the oceans around the world. And as one historian said, Englishmen who grew up in that period had a sense of a dual mission of ruling and reforming the uncivilized people of the world. Kind of grates on our modern sensibilities, but maybe it's not hard to imagine if you try to imagine yourself as a part of the British Empire in the middle of the 19th century. And along with that rapid social and economic growth, progress and growth, was this belief in progress itself as a sort of universal property of how the world, the universe operates, that it's just progressive in its basic structure. We'll come back to that here in just a minute. But along with that came this fear of degeneration. And so the French dictionary, actually written in the first decade of the 20th century, so really reflecting that late 19th century perspective, looking forward to the 20th century, saying humanity is perfectible, and it moves incessantly from less good to better, from ignorance to science, from barbarism to civilization. The idea that humanity becomes day by day better and happier is particularly dear to our century. Faith in the law of progress is the true faith of our century, meaning the 20th century, but viewed from that progressivist 19th century point of view. And this quote actually comes from Darwin. This was The Descent of Man, reflecting that fear of degeneration that was really everywhere in society. But here Darwin gives voice to that. The advancement of the welfare of mankind is the most intricate problem. So while the dictionary said it was a sort of irresistible force, here he's saying it's an intricate problem. Man, like every other animal, has no doubt advanced to his present high condition through a struggle for existence. We'll talk a lot more about that. Consequent on his rapid multiplication. And if he is to advance still higher, it is to be feared that he must remain subject to a severe struggle. So here Darwin is worrying that society is essentially becoming soft. The ideas of socialism and taking care of people are a threat to the advance of society, which is really dependent on that severe struggle that he saw around him in 19th century society. Now let's think a little bit about the scientific context in which Darwin's ideas come together. We always associate evolution with Darwin, but evolution was in fact an old idea by the time Darwin began doing his work. The first person to have a really comprehensive theory of evolution was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a Frenchman, and it was really based on the inheritance of acquired characters. And so the classic example is the giraffe who strives to reach branches higher and higher on the tree. And as he strives, that striving is passed on. He actually grows during that striving and passes it on to the next generation. So it's a way in which evolution can happen much more quickly than the way Darwin eventually theorizes, because each individual, by his striving to run faster or to reach higher or to hide from predators, actually achieves something in that striving and passes it on to the next generation. And Lamarck, so that explains adaptation, but it doesn't explain something else very important in the 19th century mind, and that is the advance from simple to complex. Life must have began with simple forms. Well, how does it become complex? Obviously, in that age, thinking of human beings as the ultimate in complexity, how does it get there? There has to be a complexifying force along with the adaptive force. There has to be two different forces in evolution. Darwin will later disagree with that, but he says, Lamarck says there has to be this complexifying force that as time goes on, animals are gaining in complexity and adapting, which incidentally with Lamarck, because all these evolutionary lines are continuing to becoming more complex, you have to have the spontaneous generation of simple forms continuously through time. That idea of the spontaneous generation of life was an idea that wasn't uniquely Lamarck's, but was around in the late 18th, early 19th century. Next thinker we want to look at is Robert Chambers, who was British and wrote in the middle of the 18th century. I think this was 1845, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. And this is a comprehensive work that really looks at really not just life, but he does look at life, but he looks at the evolution of the entire universe. Tremendously popular book. It actually outsold The Origin of Species during the 19th century. It's been eclipsed by The Origin of Species since, but a very popular book, not as popular with scientists, but very popular amongst the general public. And while he denies it, he has a very Lamarckian view of organic evolution, starting at lower states, going to higher states, in essence, a complexifying force that causes that rise in an adaptive diversification of life along the way. So both of these things happening in the evolution of life. So two different versions of evolution that were current at the time Darwin was thinking and starting to put together his ideas of evolution by natural selection. The last one we want to look at is Herbert Spencer, who became known as a social Darwinian. He became well known really before Darwin's Origin of Species, but his ideas roughly parallel those of Darwin. And you really see that the obsession with progress in Spencer's work, claiming that all structures in the universe develop from simple and undifferentiated homogeneity to complex differentiated heterogeneity, while undergoing increasing integration of differentiated parts. A lot of big words there. But it's really this idea of progress. What explains the fact that there are very simple organisms in the world and very complex organisms in the world? If we think of our society as the highest possible society, if we think of human beings as the culmination of evolution, how do we get there? What is it in nature that compels change toward those ends? And Spencer really thought of this as just a universal property of how the universe works, that progress is a universal law applying to the stars and galaxies and organisms and to human social organizations and to the human mind. And that's in the application of, eventually the application of Darwin's idea of natural selection, really a social organization becomes known as social Darwinism. While Darwin himself was never really a strong advocate or participant in it, he certainly, there were a number of times that he gave his support to the ideas of social Darwinism. So there's really no way you can quite wash Darwin clean of some of the social Darwinist theories. And you have to wonder, where does this idea of higher and lower come from? Where do people get this idea that progress is a universal law of the universe? And if you go back to the Middle Ages, there was the chain of being. This is the chain of being, and on the bottom is mineral matter all the way here at the base of the chain of being. Then there is plant matter, and then there are the very simple organisms, then higher animals, and then people, and then angels, and then God. So this was the way of looking at the organization of the earth and of the complexity of things that you see on earth, and that idea of higher and lower. That I still find myself using those words and talking about the higher plants, meaning the complex forms of plants we see growing on the terrestrial parts of the earth as opposed to algae. But in that, I'm unconsciously really hearkening back to this medieval conception of the world, that Darwin uses these words higher and lower throughout his works. This is really where, there's nothing higher in the sense of up and down. There's nothing higher about a person from an amoeba. It's more complex and more complicated, but higher and lower comes from this medieval world view. And this idea of progress becomes so explicit with these linear ideas of evolution here, monkey to man, this idea that somehow monkeys just, as if there was a goal to evolution moving toward the higher and more intelligent form of man. Our view of human evolution today is so much different. There is a tree of primate evolution. There's a tree of mammalian evolution. we end up being one twig on the edge of that tree, along with lots of other things that are alive today. You can see there are many different branches of human evolution. Many of them end up at dead ends. There isn't any obvious sense in which there's any sort of linear movement like Australopithecus in the beginning knew it was headed toward Homo.
Hey, Tom, I think you accidentally muted yourself there.
When did I do that?
Just after the Great Chain of Being slide. So right as you change to the next slide.
Okay, all right. Well, this, I wonder how that happened. I didn't, anyway. So let me back up here. I don't know if I can back up. Well, I can't back up. So this, the idea of linear change from simple to complex all throughout 19th century thought. The monkey to man diagrams are all that 19th century idea of evolution. They've been repeated over and over and over again, and you can just go on Google where if you want to look for social iconography, go onto Google and look for images, and that tells you how we think about things. And you'll see just dozens and dozens of these diagrams, many of the parodies and comic versions of it. But this idea that evolution knows where it's going and marches from simple to complex. Our ideas about evolution today are much more complicated. It's more of a branching tree approach in which from the beginning, evolution never knows where it's going. It's just changing. Many of the evolutionary lines are dead ends. And we end up with Homo sapiens in the end, but there's no sense in which evolution was aiming toward people along the way. But that idea of a linear progress and change in complex structures is just all throughout late 19th century science. This is the linear progress of human cultures. I don't know whether they still, I wouldn't doubt that in schools today, they still think of a linear progress from Stone Age to Paleolithic to Neolithic to Bronze Age to Iron Age, early civilization to higher civilization, industrial revolution. That in fact is the path of one particular human group, which ends up being Western civilization, obviously many complex civilizations in the Orient and other parts of the world, but many lines of human evolution and social organization remain in a very different state all the way up into the modern age. Equally modern in a sense because they're the product of a long period of social evolution, but we tend to think of evolution as having a goal and we're at the goal and everything is sort of headed toward us. So when we look at, say, Native Americans, we put them at a sort of lower stage of organization, lower, higher, that same iconography. It sort of slips into the way we think about the world. This is basically a late 19th century idea that we still find ourselves using to think about change in the modern era. This is one of those late 19th century ideas. I'm always railing against this idea of a simplistic idea of plant succession is marching from simple to complex as if nature knew where it was going. Again, go on Google and Planet and type in plant succession and then click images and you'll just see page after page after page of these diagrams, all different, but all exactly the same, as if nature knows what it wants to be, knows where it wants to go, and it's just marching toward those higher complex forms. Basically a 19th century idea that's found its way into the 20th century. What I want to do now is to really look at Darwin's argument. What was he trying to do with the origin of species in particular? Again, we'll mention some of his earlier work like the Voyage of the Beagle and some of his talk about human descent with the descent of man later on, but really talking about evolution by natural selection, the thing for which scientists remember Charles Darwin. There are three cornerstones to natural selection, and it's the overproduction of young, I kind of mentioned it in the last Tom talk about exponential growth of populations. This was one of the foundations of the theory of natural selection. The populations of plants and animals produce a larger number of offspring than can possibly survive given the limited opportunities or resources of any ecosystem. Hence, the vast majority of offspring will die before they reach maturity. A big oak tree during its lifetime, say a 250-year-old oak tree, has probably produced something like 1 million acorns in its life. If over many centuries, the number of big oak trees is to remain the same, then out of that 1 million acorn, exactly one survives to be 300 years old. That's what I mean by the vast majority of offspring dying as a part of natural selection. And so natural selection is dependent on the fact that those young vary from one another. Some of them will be able to survive and reproduce better than others. There's variation, and some of those young will be able to survive and reproduce while others don't. So that's variation in fitness, overproduction of young, variation in fitness, and then heredity. At least some of those traits that lead to improved fitness are inheritable. Given those three things, Darwin said, evolution by natural selection has to happen. It's a little more complicated than that, but you can see the basic structure of the argument. Overproduction of young leads to a struggle for existence. Some of those are able to survive, some of them don't, and at least some of the traits that allow that survival are inheritable, and therefore those traits have to become more common in the next generation. I really want you to listen to Darwin and not just me. If the subsistence for man, this is Malthus here, just to give you a little bit of the basis of Darwin's theory. If for the subsistence of man if for the subsistence of man, the resources of the world were to be increased every 25 years by a quantity equal to that the whole world at the present produces. In other words, I take the whole amount of food the world produces today, and I double that in 25 years, and then increase it by the same amount in another 25 years, and the same amount in another 25 years. This would allow the power of production of the earth to be absolutely unlimited. Yet still the power of population being a power of superior order, increase of human species can only be kept commensurate to the increase in the means of subsistence by the constant operation of the strong law of necessity, meaning starvation, acting as a check upon the greater power being exponential growth. So while the problem we've set up is I'm going to add the total production of the earth, whatever that is, let's call that 10 units of food. I'm going to add 10 units of food every 25 years and keep adding them. So the production of the earth goes up as a straight line. I'm adding 10 units of food every 25 years, it goes up as a straight line. But what he calls the power of population growth is this curved line. It grows exponentially. And so it begins to grow faster and faster and faster. Eventually it crosses that line, which leads to hunger and starvation. This was the Malthusian idea of population growth. It became revived again after World War II as the sort of budding ideas of environmentalism began to look at population growth and wondered about the reality of, or the possible reality of starvation and famine in the future. So Malthusian ideas don't disappear with Darwin. They remain popular with environmentalists in the late 20th century. But Darwin sees in this a critical thing. It's the finite ability of the earth to supply resources, and yet the possibility of exponential growth means that there has to be a struggle for existence. As there are more individuals are produced that can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence. He uses this phrase over and over again in the book, and it's shorthand for this fact that populations always overrun the resources, and you have death and famine and disease and suffering as a result of that. And that's the key process that is that is beneath and always powering natural selection forward. The other thing Darwin talks about is variety, and variety we're used to because every person looks different. I mean, how many people have you known in your life? And some people are similar to others, but there are no exact duplicates. The human genome is complex enough, and now think in terms of genetic variation, is complex enough that you can just have more and more and more people, and yet none of them are ever identical to any other person, past or future. But where's that? What is the importance of it? First of all, why is each organism as a species different? And is it important, or is it just sort of random variations away from some sort of ideal archetypal form? That was certainly the understanding for much of Western history, that all people are basically, sort of attempts at the same archetypal form, but we all end up, from a variety of sort of contingent variations away from that archetypal form. We all end up looking different, but it's not especially important. Or does the variation in itself have a function? And Darwin, this is one of the things Darwin is never seems to be remembered for. But what Darwin was the first to see that random variation, what seems like random variation. My nose is longer or shorter than someone else's. My hair is darker or lighter than someone else's. My eyes are slightly blue, but they're slightly different blue than many other people's eyes. Why is that important? And Darwin was the first one to see in that variation the key to understanding what a species was and how a species changed. He was the one that revolutionized our understanding of variation. That's an incredible, huge step in our understanding of life. And that's really because of Charles Darwin. And that's not something he's often remembered for. Inheritance. This is one of Darwin's, and it was not just Darwin, it was the entire 19th century. A lot of what we think of as mistakes in Darwin's work come from mistakes about his idea about inheritance. And that's because no one understood the modern genetic theory of inheritance at the time. And so if you can't understand how information moves between generations, it's hard to make generalizations about those patterns of inheritance are going to be and exactly how selection might operate. But that inheritance is real is obvious. Everyone knows that children look much like their parents, and that selective breeding of plants and animals is possible. I mean, if you have a Labradoodle, probably at least one person on the Zoom talk today has a Labradoodle, or if you don't, you know someone with one. It ends up looking kind of halfway between a Labrador retriever and a poodle because there's a cross between the two. There obviously has to be inheritance for Labrador puppies to end up growing to look like Labradors. Likewise for poodles, and for when you cross the two, for that end up looking like some crazy combination of the two. So inheritance has to work, even though no one understood quite how it worked in the 19th century. Darwin ended up subscribing to a theory called pangenesis, in which actually came from an ancient Greek called Hippocrates, but it seemed at least as plausible as any other to him. He felt like he had to have some idea of inheritance, so he adopted that one. It ended up being wrong, and some of Darwin's mistakes about evolution by natural selection go back to this mistake, but it was a mistake along with many other mistakes that was shared by basically all the other scientists of his day, other than Gregor Mendel, who we'll talk about just a little bit later. Another idea that Aristotle had was blood, and that's an interesting one because we still talk about blood. Blood is thicker than water. Inheritance, that we inherit things through the blood, an idea that sort of comes down to us in popular culture today. So let's talk about now the power of selection. So the first thing Darwin had to do was to talk about if selection of any kind could change a species over time. So in considering the origin of species, it is quite conceivable that a naturalist, reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other such facts, might come to the conclusion that species had not been independently created, but had descended like varieties from other species. So he's saying that naturalists before him did come to that very conclusion, Lamarck and Chambers being two obvious ones, but a number of others. But this is where Darwin's work in the origin of species changes everything. Nevertheless, such a conclusion, even if well-founded, would be unsatisfactory until it could be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world had been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation which justly excites our admiration. So what Darwin sees in his book is not his crowning achievement. If it isn't evolution, it is natural selection. It is evolution by natural selection. That's what he thinks is his contribution, and it ends up being his contribution to our understanding of the history of life. We shall thus see that a large amount of hereditary modification is at least possible. And what is equally or more important, we shall see how great is the power of man in accumulating by his selection of successive slight variations. So now he's talking about man's selection, which we're going to go to immediately after this. And he'll use that as a model for natural selection. I will then pass on the variability of species in a state of nature. So the first thing he's going to do in the book is to talk at great length about human selection. And to do that, he talks about the lowly pigeon. I'll just mention briefly later today about Darwin's finches, the species for which he is usually connected. But in the origin of species, the star creature is the pigeon. And as he's talking about pigeon selection and whether the fancy breeds of pigeons we have in the world today, you may not know there are fancy breeds, but there are many, many fancy breeds that were in the 19th century. And in fact, pigeon breeding had been a part of Western civilization for thousands of years. And so he wants to show how powerful is the process of selection. He's not worried about natural selection at this point, just selection in changing the way species look. And so, back. And so let's look at the tumbler pigeon. It doesn't look anything like a blue rock pigeon, does it? The tumbler pigeon just flips over and over in the air. Not only doesn't look like a blue rock pigeon, it doesn't fly like it. How about the fantail? Does this look like a blue rock pigeon to you? How about the English carrier pigeon? Those strange growths on their beak aren't a disease. That's actually pigeon fanciers have actually bred a line of pigeons. It looks more closely related, I don't know to what, but that long neck. It certainly doesn't look anything like a blue rock pigeon. And this is the powder pigeon. Talk about a strange looking bird. Bred for this amazingly large, swollen crop. And so Darwin actually kept these breeds of pigeons and he studied them. And what he found, as he studied them, Well, first of all, if you talk to pigeon breeders at the time, they were convinced that each one of these fancy breeds of pigeon must have descended from some ancestral wild form that looked like a pouter or a tumbler or an English carrier. I mean, how it doesn't look anything like a blue rock pigeon, so there must have been an extinct species it came from. And yet Darwin thought to himself, well, this would require that you have literally several dozen species of pigeon of fantastic shapes and behaviors, all of which have become extinct, in order to give rise to all these strange domesticated forms. And also what Darwin found is that when he kept these pigeons, if he let them interbreed with one another, within a couple of generations, these black wing bars started to reappear on the offspring. And so did the blue colors of the blue rock pigeon. And if you let them interbreed longer, they started to reform what looked like a blue rock pigeon. He called this the notes here somewhere. I can't think of the fancy word he used to describe that that going back to the ancestral forms. But so Darwin proposes that all of these fancy pigeons are really created by people selecting from this native blue rock pigeon, and that selection, in this case human selection, can create forms radically different from the parent form just by slow accumulation of all these slight variations over time, with a purpose of creating these. Well, probably the original breeders didn't know exactly where they were going, but they were just picking out interesting variations and breeding and breeding and breeding for those variations, ended up creating these fantastically different forms. So if people could breed such strikingly distinct varieties, all starting with the same wild blue rock pigeon, what might natural selection be able to accomplish over immeasurably longer timescales? I've called this principle by which each slight variation is useful, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. We have seen that man by selection can certainly produce great results and can adapt organic beings to his own uses through the accumulation of slight but useful variations given to him by the hand of nature. So Darwin doesn't know where the variations come from, but he knows that they're arising naturally in these pigeons with each generation. But natural selection, as we shall hereafter see, is a power incessantly ready for action and is as immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. So this is the point in the book where he's sort of launching from this basis of, and he talks about many other domestic breeds, but launching from this basic basis of man's power of selection to the plausibility of natural selection, the origin of species. As he talks about this phenomena, there are certain, I want to maybe back up slightly and talk about this idea of process and change over time that Darwin gets largely from the theories around geology that immediately preceded his work. Geologists have been establishing what they called a uniformitarian view of time and change, as opposed to a catastrophist view. The catastrophist view being one that believed in sudden, dramatic revolutions as really explaining the. Excuse me. My dog wandered in there, was starting to bark. So so geologists had wanted to confront this idea. I remember one theory of the origin of the earth was the water was on the inside and the earth sort of broke open like an egg and the water came out. There was these ideas of a fantastic sort of revolutionary idea of the earth's origins. But no, geologists had said, no, we have to interpret the earth according to natural phenomena we can observe in the earth today, the material causes operating at observable rates on the earth today. So we have to reinterpret the whole history of the Earth in terms of processes of volcanism, of erosion and sedimentation that we see operating in the Earth today. We can't admit any other fantastic causes. And to do that, geologists were very wedded to the idea of gradual change. And Darwin picked that up. In his theory of life, he said, our theory requires a very gradual introduction of new forms. The extermination of old forms or extinction might be more sudden, but never the introduction. So the evolution of new forms has to be gradual. And we start up, and so Darwin introduces this contrast between gradualism, and he was a committed gradualist. I mean, it's just every page of the book, he talks about gradual incremental change. That doesn't mean he thought that change was always at exactly the same rate, but that it was always gradual, as opposed to a saltational view. In other words, as moving forward in jumps or large changes that was typified by some of the early evolutionary theorists, and calling it the hopeful monster view of evolution, that these huge macro evolutions would create these monstrous changes, and that a few of those would survive and give rise to species. No, Darwin was a gradualist, and this Latin phrase natura non facit saltus, which means nature makes no leaps, he repeated over and over again in the book. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress, there's that word progress again, until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages. I mean, just in that quote is just commitment both to geologic time and to the accumulation of these tiny, small changes to create these huge changes in the history of life. Later on, this idea of gradualism versus saltational or change is reinvigorated in the 60s and 70s with a theory of punctuated equilibrium by two fellows named Stephen Jay Gould, who for many years wrote in the popular publication Natural History. This idea that evolution slowed down and that species remain pretty much constant for long periods of time, and then change would be in fairly rapid pulses. Rapid doesn't mean hopeful monster type things in one generation, but that evolution would speed up when small populations are isolated. He actually gets this idea from Ernst Mayr, a German evolutionary theorist of the middle of the 20th century. And so that reinvigorates this whole gradualism versus saltational change in the recent past, and it somewhat comically becomes the arguments between evolution by creeps and evolution by jerks. So you have to decide whether you're a creep or a jerk. I tend to sort of find myself more a jerk than a creep on this one, but you'll have to find out for yourself. There's supporters of both points of view. Competition is just absolutely central to the struggle of life that Darwin sees at the center of natural selection and change. The action of climate seems at first sight to be quite independent of the struggle for existence. But insofar as climate chiefly acts in reducing food, it brings into the most severe struggle between individuals, whether of the same or distinct species, which subsist on the same kind of food. So while we might think of a species adapting to a drying climate, what they're actually adapting to is a reduction in food and competing with other individuals of the same species to get that food. And the ones that can get the food survive, the ones that can't die. And so that they're in a sense adapting to the change in climate, but it's the competition between individuals that's driving change. We forget that each species, even where it most abounds, is constantly suffering enormous destruction at some period of its life. from enemies or from competitors for the same place and food. And if these enemies are competitors, being in the least degree favored by any slight change of climate, they will increase in numbers. And as each area is already fully stocked with inhabitants, the other species must decrease. So for Darwin, nature is a zero-sum game. As one species is expanding, another species has to be decreasing. There's only so much food out there. So as we think about the classic sort of tale I remember from early ideas about evolution I had in textbooks, the rabbit and the fox, the evolutionary arm race. Foxes evolved to grow and run faster and faster and faster to catch more rabbits. The rabbits evolved to run faster to get away from the fox or in more zigzaggy lines or to hide in holes. And so we have this evolutionary arms race. And while that's certainly true, what's actually happening is that foxes are competing with one another, because the one that catches the fox, one that catches the rabbit survives, the one that doesn't dies. And so the one that survives passes their, what we now know as genes, passes their genes on to the next generation. The one that doesn't dies. Rabbits likewise that can hide or run faster or in a more zigzaggy way to get away from the fox are the ones that survive. The other rabbits that are slower witted stay a moment longer out in the open before they run are the ones that die, and the ones that run away faster are the ones that survive. So it's a rat, in a sense, foxes competing with foxes and rabbits competing with other rabbits is how the actual species change over time. Even in cases where we think of a cooperative relationship like bees and flowers, we have a fly and a bee on this. It looks like a button bush that grows in a shrub that grows in our wetlands in the Midwest. With this, surely there's not much competition going on here. The bee and the flower are both need each other. The flower needs the bee for pollination. The bee needs the flower's food, nectar and pollen. But is that actually true? I mean, they do need each other, obviously, and there is a symbiosis between the two. But flowers evolve by competing with one another for access to pollinators. The ones that attract pollinating insects are the ones that survive. The ones that don't die. So the ones that attract pollinators pass their genes on to the next generation. The ones that don't die away. And so we have an evolution of flowers in the direction of flowers of many, many different forms, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different forms of flowers today, all attempting to attract pollinators. But there's that, what you might think of as merciless competition between flowers to attract pollinators. Likewise, the pollinating insects are competing with one another for pollen and nectar, and the ones that are less good at gathering pollen and nectar are dying away, not passing their genes on to the next generation, while the ones that are successful do pass their genes on. So even within cooperation is intense competition, a survival of the fittest, and evolution by natural selection. And one of the things that Darwin relies on throughout is his training as a geologist. He adored, idolized Charles Lyell, often called the father of geology, whose Principles of Geology, a 3-volume set, also some books you should read. Lyell was probably a better writer than Darwin. Darwin has his moments, but is sometimes fairly plodding. Lyell was a better writer. Another of Darwin's friends, Thomas Huxley. I like him because his name's Thomas, but he wrote a number of books. Even better writer. I remember picking up his book Physiography in a bookstore visiting England some years ago. Wonderful book to read, brilliantly written. I mean, all people that write modern textbooks should read Huxley to find out how to write a textbook to actually engage the readers, so the teachers don't have to force people to read their textbooks. Anyway, Darwin was very much a geologist at heart, and that commitment to gradualism really comes from geology. And geology is the science that understands deep time, as a later writer would call this geologic time of hundreds of millions or billions of years, deep time. Geology opens up the dimension of deep time that really makes natural evolution by natural selection possible. It is hardly possible for me to recall to the reader who is not a practical geologist the facts leading the mind feebly to comprehend the lapse of time. He who can read Sir Charles Lyell's grand work on the principles of geology, which the future historian will recognize as having produced a revolution in natural science, as is not, and yet does not admit how vast have been the past periods of time, may at once close this volume, being the origin of species. If you don't accept geologic time, then he says, just close the book. It's not worth reading. Now, we're going to go through a bit of evidence that Darwin puts forward for natural selection. Hence, I believe Darwin often really saw in varieties, what all botanists and naturalists understood, there were varieties of species, but he saw those varieties in a very different way. Not just, he didn't see them as a static thing, but rather as incipient species, as these forms that were starting to pull apart and create new species. He was the first one to really see that. We have examples of things like that in the modern world. Darwin often talks about the great difficulty in telling species and varieties apart. If you look at the 4th edition of Plants of Chicago region, you'll find Drummond's aster sagittafolius variation Drummondii. If you look at the new flora of the Chicago region, they've given that a species level. They've upgraded it to species level. They've switched to genus to Symphotrichum by breaking the aster genus into several parts, and then given each one of the species, or in this case, what was formerly a variety, have promoted it to the level of species. What Darwin would say is he's not particularly interested in that. What he is showing is that this aster sagittafolius Drummondii, or Symphotrichum Drummondii, is a species that's since happening and pulling itself apart from other closely related asters. Or the case may be put in another way, and it may be said that in the larger genera in which a number of varieties or incipient species greater than average are now manufacturing, take for instance the genus of goldenrods, which is the key goes on for about a page and a half, just dozens of species. Many of the species, he says, in these genus already manufactured still to a certain extent resemble varieties, for they differ from each other by a less than usual amount of difference. And a wonderful example of that in the key to goldenrods in the flora of the Chicago region is the difference between Solidago altissima and Solidago canadensis, which you have to look at the involucre, which is the tiny, tiny little flower cluster, and a difference of a few tenths of a millimeter in the height of the involucre between these two species. Otherwise, they're virtually identical. Still, many botanists, in fact, every flora I've looked at, recognizes these as distinct species, and yet, for someone like me looking at them, you'd think they were, if anything, only very slight varietal differences. When forms which can be considered as good and distinct species are united, their fertility graduates from 0 to near perfect fertility. In other words, the established biological species concept at Darwin's time said that, well, it's easy to tell varieties from species. Species, when intercrossed, are sterile, and varieties that, when intercrossed, are fertile. That's easy. But Darwin starts looking at it and starts talking to naturalists, and he really finds out, not that no one knew this before Darwin, but that's actually not really true. And that when united species, the fertility of the offspring graduates from 0 to near perfect fertility. Their fertility is eminently susceptible to favorable and unfavorable conditions and is innately variable. And we can think of two species, undeniable species in our area, white oak and bur oak, that will occasionally cross. In fact, we can now look with molecular biology, look at the genetics in alba and macrocarpa, and we can see that, yes, there are macrocarpa genes floating around in the alba population, and there are alba genes floating around in the macrocarpa population. So not only do they cross and occasionally create this hybrid called Libiana, but that one back crosses with either parent. And so there is an integration of genes between these two species. So the biological species concept, while it's kind of more or less true for most species, it's not really true. And in fact, some species, some good and distinct species are fully interfertile with one another. So it really blurs the distinction between varieties and species, which is what Darwin is trying to say here. Varieties are really just incipient species. And so when we look at varieties today, we're seeing the process of natural selection at work. Another evidence for natural selection, anyone who does butterfly surveys has to try to learn how to tell these two apart. It's not easy when they flutter by. The viceroy is certainly a size smaller. That's often how I first recognize it, but it's awfully hard to be sure unless you can catch it and look for the slight difference in wing bars here on the viceroy as opposed to the monarch. Why on earth the viceroy? Why would the viceroy mimic a monarch, or vice versa? I suppose initially we wouldn't know which it was, but we can look at closely related species to viceroy. All are very different from this color pattern. It turns out that the ancestral viceroy species must have, just by chance variation, have started to look like a monarch, maybe just in its color, maybe in some of the wing bar patterns. And by looking like a monarch, we know that monarchs are very distasteful to birds. They don't like to eat monarch butterflies, and so they avoid them. And so if you have just a slight resemblance to a monarch, you might be given some protection. So while it wouldn't be total protection, you would be eaten slightly less often than those of the viceroy population that didn't look like a monarch. And so given that slight resemblance, that would tend to be passed on to the next generation, exaggerated again with that generation, the next and the next and the next, until eventually you come up with something that's a pretty darn good mimic. And predators avoid the viceroy as they avoid the monarch. This is Darwin talking about the same thing. Now, if a member of one of these persecuted species, referring to the viceroy, and rare groups, which are relatively rare in comparison to the monarch, were to assume a dress so like that of a well-protected species that it continually deceived the practiced eyes of an entomologist, it would often deceive predaceous birds and insects and thus often escape destruction. Another wonderful example in our area of mimicry is the fox snake, which has a color pattern very similar to timber rattlers, which weren't native to this area, or Massasaugas that were native to this area, rattlesnakes. And it turns out that the fox snake vibrates its tail when it's agitated. It doesn't have a rattle, but it vibrates its tail. And if there are dry grasses or leaves around, it can set off a sort of rattling sound. I've several times as the field station ecologist with a conservation district gotten phone calls about rattlesnakes, not just one, but whole dens of rattlesnakes in McHenry County. And undoubtedly what they're looking at are fox snakes that are agitated and vibrating their tail and look, other than for the fact, well, I suppose when the tail is vibrating, maybe you can't see if there's not a rattle on it. But it also, I mean, I just thought of that this morning, that Massasaugas have been persecuted to virtual extinction in our area, just tiny populations left. If the Massasauga, typically the mimic is mimicking a popular form. It's mimicking a snake that's widespread and has large populations and is therefore avoided by predators. Well, now Massasaugas are almost absent. Massasaugas must have been in the past not only present over the area, but a very common snake, such that fox snakes, in an evolutionary sense, learned to avoid it in order to survive, or not avoid this Massasauga, but avoid the predator by mimicking the Massasauga. Homologous parts, another argument of Darwin's for evolution, that why does the bat, cat, whale, human all have basically the same parts in the same relative positions. And the obvious to Darwin's answer to that is that they all descend from a common ancestor that had limbs with the same skeletal pattern. we've seen that the members of the same class, independently of their habits of life, resemble each other in the general plan of their organization. This resemblance is often expressed by the term unity of type, or by saying that the several parts and organs in different species of a class are homologous. This is one of my favorite arguments, and he looks at the blind salamanders in Europe and in the New World, two different genera. They end up looking very much alike. They're living in almost identical situations, the limestone caves of Europe and the limestone caves of North America, and they end up looking very similar, and yet they evolve not only different in species, they're different at the generic level. And what obviously the case is that salamanders from the above ground world wandered into limestone caves in North America, and salamanders in the European world wandered into limestone caves in Europe and evolved into very similar forms, but from very different ancestors. He says, on my view, we must suppose that American animals, having in most cases ordinary powers of vision, slowly migrated by successful generations from the outer world to the deeper and deeper recesses of the Kentucky caves, as did European animals into the caves of Europe. And so we have this sort of what's later on called convergent evolution, starting from two different origins to things that look very similar. This diagram you see here is the only diagram in the Origin of Species, and it's Darwin's attempt. He actually goes on for several pages talking about this. I'm only going to deal with this very briefly right now. But this is the first tree of life, published tree of life. There was an earlier one in his notebooks, but this is the first published tree of life. And what he sees in this is this pattern of group within group. That if you have evolution by natural selection, a species giving rise to a genus, and some of the members of that genus that have been giving rise to other genera, and therefore the original one now being at the family level, you have this nesting of group within group within group. We see that in all species on Earth are nested together in this group within group within group. Finally, we have seen that natural selection, which follows from the struggle for existence and which almost inevitably leads to extinction and divergence of character in the descendants from any one parent species, explains that great and universal history in the affinities of all organic beings, namely the subordination in group under group. Just in passing, I just want to note Darwin is always associated with the finches. He noted this in his book on it's in his notebooks, his notes he took on the voyage, then his notebooks on the transmutation of species, and then shows up in his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. But here you see that, for instance, let's take the small tree finches here, parvulus, and then there are the large tree finches. All of those are then the tree finches here. They're united with the insect eaters here, another group, then united together with the bud eaters over here into the tree finches, and then united with the ground finches, and then united with the warbler finches back to the common ancestors. So that's it. It's a unity of type within the whole group, but that descent, so you get this pattern of group within group within group. That is the evidence of evolution by natural selection. And then Darwin talks really at some length about the difficulties of the theory. He is aware of it. He was already being criticized. I mean, he wrote a very quick version of his theory in 1845, and so it was current in sort of in the intellectual community, and in the sort of the literate society of the day. People already knew he was working on this idea long before The Origin was published. and he was being criticized about natural selection even before that. And so he included some of those answers to the criticisms in the origin itself. One of the criticisms he made goes back to his idea of pangenesis. The tissues in the body throw off these genetic particles. So right now, as I'm sitting here, my muscles, my brain, all the parts of my body are throwing off these tiny genetic particles. They accumulate in the sex organs, that those are then passed on to the next generation. This allows for a degree of permanence, so they're actually particles of inheritance that can last for a number of generations. And then so that in the case of the pigeons, I couldn't come up with the word, but that reversion to past forms could happen because those particles of inheritance were still there. But it also allows for the generation of particles of inheritance during the life of the organism, this inheritance of acquired characters, which we now know doesn't happen, at least not in the way that Lamarck thought about it. But if you think about, and Darwin is sometimes criticized because pangenesis allows, and while Darwin emphasized evolution by natural selection, he never completely closed the door on evolution by the inheritance of acquired characters. Well, it's easy to criticize him on. If you stop to think about it, there really wasn't any way he could close the door. There was no real proof that that wasn't possible. And so for him, pangenesis allows for both these particles of inheritance that move from generation to generation, but it also opens up at least the possibility of the inheritance of acquired characters. And so I don't think he was ever completely satisfied with it. Eventually, toward the end of his life, he abandoned it under pressure, but he never really understood exactly how this occurred. If you think about this, I already said most of this, but in order for this to work, if you're constantly creating more gemmules, then obviously the old ones eventually have to disappear. There'd be sort of an infinite number in whatever germ cells you're passing on in reproduction. And so he has to hypothesize a sort of continuous source, a more rapid source of variation that actually exists. It's a problematic idea, and it leads most importantly to the idea of blending inheritance, which was the real problem for Darwin with pangenesis. And that is the idea, let's for instance say that the population is white, and along comes this odd variety that's red. Well, with pangenesis and blending inheritance, then all the offspring are pink. And not only that, but since almost all but one of the previous generation are red, the likelihood is all these pink ones are going to interbreed with white forms and create an even more faded pink, and again, an even more faded pink and an even more faded pink. And it's unlikely that one red individual that lives for only a short period of time, all of that will just be washed away and have no effect. So blending inheritance has a real problem. And Darwin's only way around that problem was just to assume that the red variants just kept happening and would eventually, by natural selection, if it were advantageous, if plants were red or something like that, and or if pollinator insects were really looking for red flowers, that they would just keep selecting out those red variants, and so it would eventually overwhelm the whites. But blending inheritance with a weakness. We now know that inheritance functions by these things called genes, and by variations on genes we call alleles that pass between generations. There are discrete factors. Every organism has two factors. In the classic cases, eye color I always use. I got a brown-eyed gene or a blue-eyed gene from my father, a blue-eyed gene from my mother. Because my father had brown eyes, he was heterozygous. He had both a blue-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene. The brown-eyed was dominant. So there's that law of segregation. We have two factors for each generation. The factors are inherited independently, and one tends to dominate the other. That's not strictly speaking true, but it was this was Mendel's laws to begin with, and they go a long way toward explaining how inheritance actually works. This didn't really come to light until after Darwin was dead. In fact, evolution by natural selection was highly controversial until Mendel's laws were rediscovered in the early 20th century. The synthesis of Mendelian genetics, the new science of statistics, and the ideas of evolution by natural selection created what's called a neo-Darwinian synthesis in the early 20th century. And that's really when the idea of natural selection becomes really essentially a fact treated by the body of scientists who call themselves evolutionary biologists as a fact of how evolution on the planet Earth happened in the origin of species. One of the other really problems for Darwin in his theory of evolution by natural selection and his continued insistence on the slight gradual changes over vast amounts of time is that in the present time, we have, we have a fox and a wolf. And they're both obviously dog-like. And we might say that they come from some primitive canine ancestor, and they do. But why don't we have everything between a fox and a wolf out there today, and between a fox and a wolf and a coyote and a jackal? Why don't we have all of those varieties out there today, just living in the world today? And his answer was a selective elimination of primitive and intermediate forms. Numberless intermediate varieties linked closely together, all the species of the same group must assuredly have existed. But the very process of natural selection constantly tends to exterminate the parent forms and the intermediate links. And so those are short-lived. They're around, but they're in a sense automatically eliminated as evolution moves forward. And the other thing he says about the absence and transitional forms has to do with the geological record. I quote this at some length because it's one of the most famous quotes from the Origin of Species, and one I think where Darwin, not a great writer, it gets above his limitations here. I look at the geological record as a history of the world, imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved, and of each page, only here and there a few lines. Each word of the slowly changing language, more or less different in the successive chapters, may represent the forms of life which are entombed in our consecutive formations, and which falsely appear to have been abruptly introduced. In other words, he's saying many of these intermediate forms were there, they just weren't recorded in the fossil record because the fossil record is so incredibly incomplete. On this view, the difficulties are greatly diminished or even disappear. So how can these, this one in fact is used often in debates about evolution today. How can perfect structures like the eye evolve in slow incremental steps? What good would I think it's supposed to say 1/100th of an eye be to an organism when, a fully functional eye is often quite useful. What possible good would a tiny bit of it be? And Darwin asked the question, to suppose that the eye with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberrations could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. But he looks at the example. As I say, Darwin was not just a theorizer, he was a naturalist. He looked at the tiny variations in life. And he says we can look at mollusks in the world today and find mollusks like the limpet, which just have spots of photoreceptor cells. And those seem to be of use to the limpet to at least sense the presence or absence of light. And those photoreceptor cells are then drawn into a pit, like the slit shell mollusks, that may begin to create some sort of sense of depth to the light or where the light is coming from. And then we have a simple optical cup, and the closing of that cup and creating, I mean, in a tiny little hole. If you don't think this is true in your near sight, you just look through a pinhole and you'll see how that corrects your vision. This slight aperture here with the pinhole lens and these receptive cells then starting to look like the retina of your eye, the refractive lens starting to form in the murex, a snail, and in the octopus, an eye that is at least structurally quite similar to the vertebrate eye with a refractive lens, muscles that allow it to change its shape to focus on what's a retina-like form, and optic nerves that then take those to the brain. And each one of these slight changes are useful to the organism that holds it. So he said, we reflect on a wide, diversified and graduated range of structures in the eyes of lower animals. And when we bear in mind how small the number of all living forms must be in comparison to those which have become extinct, the difficulty ceases to be very great. The natural selection may have converted the simple apparatus of an optic nerve coated with pigment and invested by transparent membrane into an optical instrument as perfect as the eye. The question of a wing. Birds fly with wings. And people have wondered about bird flight ever since the ancient Greeks and probably long before that, and wanted to be able to fly. But what good would 10th of a wing do? You just sit there and flap it, but you can't take off. But it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see the wing as a structure that could be of other uses, like it's of the feathered arms could be initially for warmth. It could later evolve into a larger structure that's used in threat behavior, puffing up and looking large when you're threatened by a predator, or in sexual mate selection. We know lots of examples of animals, birds in particular, but also other animals that puff up as a part to look big and impressive, or colorful to impress their prospective mates. There are grebes that really don't fly, but just use it to propel themselves across the water. So it's merely a form of propulsion, but not flight. Just as the wings of a flying squirrel are for gliding. I mean, squirrels have not yet have the power of full flight, but some mammals do, like bats. All the way to get to flying. So each of these stages in the development of the wing of the modern bird were advantageous to the primitive ancestors. Why do organisms have traits and structures that serve no purpose, like the tailbone, our tailbone? The only purpose is occasionally you sit on it hard and it hurts. Or the webbed feet of a goose that lives on dry land, or the rudimentary toes of a horse. And the answer is those rudimentary structures are vestigial. They're a product of our evolutionary ancestors. This is the best quote I could find on that. He actually hints at this several times. No one will say that a rudimentary or atrophied organs are of high physiological and vital importance. I mean, our tailbone really doesn't do anything very important. Yet undoubtedly, organs in this condition are often of very high value and classification. By classification, he's referring to the community of our descent with other primates. And that's exactly what that tailbone tells us. And now, this is really why Darwin has become so important to me as a conservationist. And in my thinking about where conservation is today and why we do it, and the possibilities for conservation in the future, which is something I think about very often. And that wasn't the reason I read Darwin initially. It wasn't what I initially got out of reading The Origin of Species. I've talked about a lot of that already, but Darwin as the conservationist is what I want to talk about right now. Because nature before and apart from Darwin is really very different. And I would contend that the idyllic, peaceful, beautiful nature that we celebrate in landscape paintings of the Romantic period. And we still celebrate whenever we're trying to sell conservation to the general public today. We have scenes that look very much like the Romantic landscape paintings of a pre-Darwinian worldview, or the Nature Conservancy in Illinois and Arkansas. The security of these landscapes, the constancy of them, their peacefulness, their timeless, their harmoniousness. For some of you, some of these ideas may be more than others, but we're drawn to them. We're drawn to this, and for good reason. I mean, I enjoy nature probably for many of these reasons. I calm down. I may be angry at some bureaucratic email I had to deal with, but then I leave and I start walking on the trails in Glacial Park, and it just goes away after a while. Of course, I'm human. These things mean something to me, but and that's I'm trying to capture this ethos of a pre-Darwinian world, that nature is good and is the source of good, that nature embodies a higher purpose immanent in the universe, that nature is balanced, harmonious, and timeless entity. Nature unfolds according to a plan. There can be intrinsic values intrinsic to nature or immanent in nature. And there can be objectively good and bad states of nature. I mean, I've had many times talking with people who are doing restoration about why are we leaving that? Well, it just belongs there. It belongs. There's that sense. It's a pre-Darwinian way of looking at the world. I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong in a spiritual sort of sense, but it's a very pre-Darwinian way of looking at the world, that the native plant belongs there and buckthorn doesn't. Nature after Darwin's a very, very different place. And this is what I meant when I in the advertising blurb that said that we're often running away from Darwin as we're running toward them in the modern day, particularly as conservationists. We find the Darwinian view of life a bit uncomfortable. Here Darwin says, by nature, I mean only the aggregate action and product of many natural laws. And that doesn't seem like an unremarkable sentence. But I want you to stop to think about that. I mean, do you think that Henry Thoreau would have said that? Do you think Ralph Waldo Emerson would have said that? Do you think John Muir would have said that? That's what nature was. It was only the aggregate action and product of many natural laws. That's an utterly materialistic view of nature. Basically, it's what you can observe and measure, and the material causes you can see operating the world, and you've got to figure out nature from that basis. And that was just so thoroughly Charles Darwin. And this seemingly innocent sentence, I think, is not that innocent at all. It is interesting to complicate it. This is right near the end of The Origin of Species. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank. We all walk past these thickets along trails, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth. We've all been there. And this is where Darwin goes. From the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted objects which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. What I'm trying to emphasize now is that the engine inside of evolution by natural selection, here he uses rather colorful language. It's the war of nature, it's famine and death. That's the engine, the productive engine inside of the theory of natural selection that propels life forward. That's a very radically different view of life. And it's one that we don't often associate with Darwin, because we automatically we make him into the old man with the gray beard. And we talk about evolution and we think about evolution as sort of evolution of better and higher forms. But we forget that core of the theory, that idea that it's all dependent on the overproduction of dung, massive death and famine, and only from that do you get advancement. So extinction for Darwin is just every day. So here is that diagram. Again, I showed all those little red dots are species that go extinct before we get to this last time period, of which there are only, in this case, 5 that survive. There are, in fact, I say, their outset, there are 6 species, 5 survive, 83 go extinct along the way. This is Darwin's view of life. It looks innocent when you look at the page and just look at that branching diagram, but he's telling you that 83 species go alive for 5 that survive today. You know, it's variously quoted. I got this from several sources. I don't know whether it's 99.9%, whether it's 99% or 99.999%. I suspect if you actually looked at microbial life down at the bacterial level, for which we have essentially no good fossil record, and that's most of the diversity of life on Earth in the past and in the present, it would be 99.9999999% of life that's ever existed on Earth is now extinct. Only a vanishingly small part of that is still on the Earth today. And yet what is on the Earth today was dependent on all of that extinction in order to be here today. Judging from the past, I love this quote. Judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity. Not one living species. And of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to the distant futurity. For the manner in which all organic beings are grouped shows that the greatest number of species of each genus and all the species of many genera have left no descendants, but have become utterly extinct. And so you occasionally hear conservationists today arguing that we should keep rare species alive today because they could evolve into all sorts of things. And it is possible. There's no way you could say it's impossible. But Darwin time again says, well, rarity is the precursor of extinction. And our rare species today are almost certain to go extinct and almost certain to leave no evolutionary ancestors. So the reason to preserve them today isn't because they're going to lead to whole new types of life in the future, or at least that's a pretty poor argument. In all likelihood, they'll eventually disappear, hopefully not for a long time. But within millions of years, of course they'll go, probably within thousands of years. Who knows what the future of human society is. We're the ones that are protecting them today. But this makes a case that probably evolution is fine. You know, you don't have to worry about evolution. We could do our worst and evolution will fill the world up with species again. It has over and over and over again in the history of life. What is precious today is the species that are here today. Extinction is a necessary part of the history of life and in fact plays a creative role by eliminating one set of species and allowing another to prosper. Even if we remove the Victorian progressionist biases, Darwin gives us a living world, a history of life in which creation and extinction are intimately tied together. We wouldn't be what we are today. We wouldn't even be here today if it weren't for the Cretaceous extinction that finished off the dinosaurs and really unleashed mammalian adaptive diversification, eventually creating primates, eventually became hominids, essentially, this in essence. So extinction and speciation are intimately tied together in the context of geologic time. The formation and destruction of whole continental areas and mountain ranges are routine events. Mountains like the Rocky Mountains have risen and been eroded back into the ocean again countless times. The destruction of Earth and the extinction and creation of species are normal occurrences, not unusual occurrences, normal, thus changes. For Darwin, the utter materialist, were devoid of any moral implications. I mean, this is, I often, for a while I was reading Darwin, just trying to find one little scrap to hold on to, one little bit that would tell me that Darwin was a conservationist. But I don't think you'll ever find it. He was an utter materialist, just looked at time and change. I say just sort of ruthlessly. I mean, that was his genius as a scientist. That's what allowed him to break the mold. That's why I call him the man who broke nature. I mean, you'd think, well, why am I doing this? Am I sort of disproving conservation? Nice thing for me to do, employed by the conservation district. What I'm trying to make is perhaps there's really the point I'm trying to make is perhaps there really is no scientist or authority figure to tell us what to do or what to think. Maybe we want to think conservation is really based on really smart people that have factually said we should do this. And so when we do it, we can also say, well, blah, 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 told us to do it. And that's why we're doing it. But maybe that really doesn't work. And is that a bad thing? Is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing that scientists really, that if I go out and restore or are part of working on restoring an oak savanna ecosystem, I can't really say there are a lot of scientists that can really confirm that what I'm doing is the thing I should do. I may think it's important, but I can't really say it's because scientists tell me to do that. Is that a bad thing? Or is the truth really liberating? This is the conclusion I came to after struggling with Darwin for decades. I think that truth is actually liberating. No one's telling us what to do. It's up to us. It's up to us. We are here today. We're a contingency of history, human civilization here today. We're here with a lot of other plants and animals. We have a history of the landscape that we've learned about. And so we're sort of co-inhabiting the world along with them. It's up to us to look around us and see what is worthwhile, what is worth saving, what is worth dedicating ourselves to. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that really is the essence of ecological restoration, the essence of conservation. And that's why both I call Darwin the man who broke nature, and why for me as a conservationist, he's become an inspiration. Thank you. And I'll take any questions now. That's
Thanks,
do we have any
Tom.
que-
We'll
we have
have the opportunity if you would like to either unmute or add your questions in the chat. I'll read a couple of the comments that people put in earlier. Back at the beginning, we had some folks laughing at Darwin's thoughts about his marriage.
Yeah, that was good. It's true. That's what was in his notebook. So.
Comment from Janet. I wonder why linear processes are often depicted as a pyramid when the lower segments are visually larger than the higher segments.
That's it. Well, I'm glad they asked that question because I did think of that. Maybe it's because we want to see ourselves as civilization as this rare achievement, and that there was all these uncivilized people at the very bottom grubbing around for roots and berries, and that only the select few of us made it to that highest pinnacle of the social pyramid. I'm glad someone asked that question because I'd never looked at that pyramid and saw the iconography of the pyramid before. Thank you. That's a good question.
Comment that English carrier pigeons look like runner ducks.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, if someone showed me a picture of that bird, didn't tell me it was a pigeon, I wouldn't have known it was a pigeon. Some of the other ones, I probably could have guessed were a pigeon. And maybe if I'd seen the carrier pigeon move, it sort of moves like a pigeon a little bit anyway. But Darwin saw that as first he had to show that selection could change, that the addition of tiny little increments of change over long periods of time could produce huge changes in what we now think of as the morphology or the look of an organism. And that was the first step in then talking about natural selection. He had to show that change by selection was possible. And it actually takes up a good chunk of his book. One of the things I want to do is to invite you to read the book. It is an easily accessible book. Anyone can read it. If you read it once, then you'll get out. Maybe I'll give you a head start and you get out something out of it you wouldn't have if you read it, as I did, cold without really any background. But you'll get a lot out of it the first time through. And I can guarantee you, if you have a continued interest in conservation and ecology, you'll get something else out of it every time you read it. Every time I go through that book, there's a phrase, there's a sentence there's a chapter that I see in a new light. It is a remarkable, remarkable book.
I had a comment from Ken. I'm a jerk too, as is the fossil record, in spite of chapter 4.
Yeah, I think, well, there are still committed gradualists, and the argument between sort of gradualists in evolution and punctuated equilibrium is really very complex, and I don't want to get into that. It's not as if it's a simple case one way or the other, but I tend to be more the punctuated equilibrium type. Was a big fan of Stephen Jay Gould and his essays. And, I guess I'm a jerk. You heard it here first.
We had a book recommendation. Dazzled and Deceived, Mimicry and Camouflage by Peter Forbes. A good read about the subject.
That sounds good.
Another comment. Oh, go ahead.
I was just, the slide where I showed you the fox snake and the Massasauga, I put that together weeks and weeks ago. But one of the points Darwin makes about mimicry is that the mimicked form, in this case, like the monarch butterfly that's distasteful to birds, has to be the more common. And so birds then gain the habit of not eating it. If it were really rare, then birds really wouldn't very strongly gain the habit. It has to be common, and the mimicker is the uncommon form, which is true. If you go around in nature, you'll see, 50 monarchs or more than that for every, even though there are less monarchs today than it used to be, 50 of them for every viceroy that you see. But think about that with the Massasauga. That means the Massasauga must have been a very common snake through much of the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, when fox snakes evolved that behavior. Now Massasaugas are extremely rare, and so the vibrating of the tail makes no sense. There are no rattlesnakes around to mimic. Go ahead, Jackie. That's what I mean by every time you think about this, you think of something new. Go ahead, Jackie.
We had another comment. Gould, in his book about the fossils of Burgess Shale, argued that evolution was extremely random and certainly not linear.
Yeah, that was a great book. That was a Wonderful Life, a takeoff of the Jimmy Stewart movie, A Wonderful Life, about contingencies in history and how the patterns of life today are dependent on acts in the distant past that have perhaps sometimes very little to do with a slow and methodical natural selection, but rather with, in some cases, rather giant catastrophes like asteroids hitting the Earth, which don't really, the extinctions that have after the animals could have been supremely well adapted to the Cretaceous Earth prior to the asteroid hitting it. But suddenly the world just changed abruptly. Boom, it's different. It's a different world. And a supremely adaptive organism then dies out, whereas this other organism that was barely clinging on suddenly becomes it's not really well adapted, because adaptation implies that you're actually adapting to something. It's just by chance its morphology allows it to survive in a radically changed world, and that changes the whole history of life. The Burgess Shale, great read, wonderful book, definitely recommended.
Another question, how about the deception/mimicry of a moth that looks like bird poop? Fascinating.
Yeah, I guess in that case, it's sort of, I think that would be an example of camouflage, I think, unless you had a predator of bird poop and you are mimicking, because mimicry generally is mimicking another species, but in this case, you're mimicking another form. At one point, I showed you a slide about the 3 cornerstones of natural selection. There were the moth and 2 different forms of the moth. Famous example of Britain in the industrial age, I think it was the light-colored moth was the historical form, but the world became so dark and dingy with all the coal burning that the moth actually evolved a dark form to hide on the dark, sooty landscape and buildings of industrial Britain. So an example of natural selection taking place in short order. So in that case, probably the moth is evolving, essentially mimicking or camouflaging itself. I guess it's actually mimicking a non-living form. I don't know what you would call that, mimicry or camouflage, but basically the same thing.
So far, that's all the questions in the chat. Again, if you have other questions, feel free to type them. The icon is down at the bottom of the screen. You type and then hit enter. Otherwise, you can unmute and ask.
If you've got one minute, I want to show you one more slide. It's a fascinating episode, really in the history of, I'll call it the history of conservation. I don't think it was actually, well, it may have been thought as conservation at the time. And it's Ascension Island. This is an island in the Atlantic Ocean near the equator. And it's over 1,000 miles from Africa and South America. It's on the mid-Atlantic ridge. I don't want to get in too much into the geology, but it's the same geologic feature where Iceland appears much further north, where the ocean crust is actually ripping apart. And it's a constant line of volcanoes underneath along that suture line. And in some cases, the volcanoes grow above the ocean, hence the case of Iceland. And here, a much, much smaller, this is about 7 miles from east to west and about 6 miles from north to south, a tiny island isolated in the Atlantic Ocean. Darwin stops by here in 1836 on his way back on the voyage of the Beagle. He's very close to home. It's not a very interesting island to Darwin because it's basically just a volcanic rock. And there are about 20, 30 species of plants there, some ferns and some broadleaf plants and a few grasses. How they got there, we don't know. Probably there were a lot of ocean bird colonies there. So probably somewhere or another, the birds by accident transported a few there. But in any event, very boring flora. Darwin thinks it's a pretty ugly island and not very interesting. He leaves. A few years later, his friend, Joseph Hooker, who has just been to Antarctica, is coming back, stops at the same island, walks around, looks at it, sees the same things, and Hooker and Darwin, I think, exchanged like 1,400 letters during their life. And so they are talking via letter about Ascension Island, and Darwin says, this is one of the points where you would say Darwin is kind of not a proto-conservationist. Darwin comes up with this idea, wouldn't it be great if we took lots of tropical plants from all over the world and brought them there in order to populate the island with many more species, particularly with trees, but a much more highly developed vegetation. There was already a naval base there, and that would improve the environment for sailors who were there. And so that was an exchange of letters. It turns out that Hooker is the son of the then director of the Kew Botanical Gardens in London, even at the time, a large botanical garden with collections from around the world. Remember, this is the age of the British Empire. And so there are collections from tropical areas all around the world. And in 1850, the Royal Navy starts shipping tropical plants from Kew Gardens down to Ascension Island and begins planting them there. And rapidly, over a few decades, the island is transformed into a tropical, at least the upper areas of the island are transformed into a tropical island. This is called Green Mountain. This would have been covered in ferns when Hooker saw it. And by the end of the century, it was then covered in tropical forest. It remains so today. It is thought of by some people as an utter disaster of conservation in which we intentionally destroyed a small native flora for our own purposes, and others by this wonderful example of terraforming, of showing how you can convert basically a bare rock into this lush forest. I'll leave you to decide which the answer is, but this is the sense in which, interestingly, Hooker, later in life, regretted what had happened. He he remembered what had been lost. He remembered climbing the mountain 3,000 feet above the ocean that was blanketed in ferns, all of which was gone by the end of the century. And by the time Hooker was an old man, Darwin, as far as I know, never addressed the idea again. For him, it was simply an example of the superiority of species from other areas of the world that evolved in areas where there were many more competing species, many more closely allied forms. And so they were by nature, therefore more highly organized and more fit, and so would naturally take over the island when released there. Darwin saw these things, the introduction of continental forms onto oceanic islands, not as a disaster for conservation, but as evidence for evolution by natural selection. That's a hard one to swallow for me as a conservationist, but I just have to accept Darwin as a brilliant 19th century mind who just never really understood the perils of what would happen over the decades and centuries after he would die. So yeah, it's fascinating. You should look up, if you're interested in this, just type in Ascension Island and you can get numerous websites and you'll get points of view of people who sound like you and me talking about trying to preserve remnants of the old flora on the island. And you'll find many scientists lauding it as this wonderful experiment in terraforming that we may be able to use when we colonize other planets, if you believe in such things. Anyway, I thought that was I wanted to leave that to the end, if only if we had time. That we're over 11 or over 12, but wonderful example. And I think great to show just the radical difference in the 19th century mind and both the radical difference and the similarity of the 19th century mind and the modern mind. Anyway, I will stop share at this point. Thank you for coming today. It's not, I probably sounded enthusiastic at points there because I was. Darwin has meant a lot to me over the years, to a lot of people, but to me personally, and reading and rereading the book and reading all sorts of books on Darwinia has really, I think, helped to shape me as an ecologist and my ideas about conservation today. So I just wanted an opportunity to share those with you.
Thanks everybody for coming. We don't currently have any other topics scheduled in the meantime. We usually take a break during the summertime to focus on our field season as things ramp up when things are growing. You can always email me with ideas for topics if there's something you'd like to see. Otherwise, we hope you have a wonderful day and hope to see you out in the field.
Thank you.
Bye.